野球しようぜ。
オッケー。
姿三四郎。通れよ。ほら。
姿三四郎。
Sega Saturnしろ。
Since bowing out of the console race over 20 years ago, we're still yet to see anyone quite like Sega, hitting lofty heights and shocking lows with as much breakneck speed as their nippy blue hedgehog, all in the space of a decade. It's no wonder the saga of Sega in the 90s still holds an air of reverence. A true veteran of the console wars, this plucky underdog, or underhog if you will, managed an impossible feat. At the height of Nintendo's power, they beat that Goliath at their own game, taking the home console market by storm with the hip, trendy, and oh so radical Mega Drive, or Genesis if you want to get Sega of America about this. For an all too brief moment in the early 90s, they were on top of the world until it all came crashing down in a storm of company division, fierce competition, and baffling decisions in a swiftly changing market. And one console sits at the heart of this storm: the Sega Saturn. This was to be Sega's entry into the 32-bit market, and on paper the run-up was perfect. Old rivals Nintendo were running late and Sony were cocky but inexperienced newcomers. But somehow Sega fumbled, and in a cruel twist of fate, the Saturn's legacy became famous not for its own accomplishments, but the actions of their new challenger, whose legendary $2.99 mic drop moment at E3 1995 left the more expensive Saturn dead upon arrival. The poor thing only lasted a few hours. The Saturn still gained a good cult following, as its top-quality arcade ports, hidden gems, and unique blend of 2D and 3D hardware gave it an unmistakably distinct personality. However, it was also a masterclass in how not to break into the newly emerging 3D console space. And because the Saturn was so intrinsically linked with Sega's turn of fortunes, it makes this story such a fascinating one, covering not just a single console failure, but the beginning of the end for Sega's hardware empire. So get comfy, grab your funky Nights into Dreams hat and sink into that Daytona bucket chair, because it's one hell of a ride to Saturn. For full context, let's head back to the origin point of Sega, or should we say, Sega's Genesis? I don't get it. All the way back in 1940, Sega was founded under the name Standard Games, producing coin-operated arcade games in Hawaii before moving to Japan in 1952 and becoming Service Games of Japan. Hey! Pay attention, this is relevant, if only to remember Sega's long history in the arcade business, decades before video game tech, where mechanical games and slot machines were the norm. Don't you dare fall asleep. Of course, Sega's story really picks up in the 90s thanks to their generation-defining Genesis and/or Mega Drive. Following their humble SG-1000 and Master System, the third time was the charm. Launching in 1988 to 1989, the Genesis got ahead of the upcoming Super Nintendo by a couple of years, and while it couldn't dislodge Nintendo's firm grasp in Japan, in Western markets, it was a smash hit. In 1990, Sega hired Tom Kalinske, you might have heard of him, as president of Sega of America to push the advantage in the US, and a year later, a certain rapid blue boy debuted, kickstarting the golden era for Sega. Armed with Sonic, a sassy, speedy mascot infinitely cooler than a plump, mustachioed plumber, along with a relentless marketing campaign dissing their rivals with classic slogans like Sega does what Nintendon't, all while pushing their hardware superiority with gimmicks like blast processing, Sega cleaned up the competition. Suddenly, they had the hip, trendy console compared to the childish Nintendo with all their baby games. Project Saturn began as early as 1992, as despite success in the West, Japan was no closer to joining Team Blue. More detail on the Saturn's design is coming soon, but let's just say Sega became increasingly worried about the competition, which influenced their 32-bit machine considerably. With the Panasonic 3DO and Atari Jaguar already out and Sony's upcoming console gaining hype, Sega started bolting on parts to Saturn's existing hardware and pushing for an earlier launch, along with a stopgap solution to stall their rivals, the 32X add-on for the Genesis. This visible panic was a far cry from their cool confidence of the Genesis era. On the 21st of November 1994, the 32X launched in North America, while one day later, their next-generation Saturn arrived in Japan. Crucially, they beat PlayStation to the punch by a couple of weeks in Japan, and amazingly, this plan worked. At least to begin with. Despite boasting only 2 exclusives out of 5 launch titles, Saturn sold 500,000 units compared to PlayStation's 300,000. Truly a Christmas miracle! In the US, Saturn was set for a September 1995 launch, heavily marketed as Saturn Day the 2nd. Oh, that's so clever. But Sega of Japan couldn't hold their nerve, and encouraged by the early lead, they told Kalinske the release date would be secretly brought forward. The new date, May the 11th, 1995, at the inaugural E3 trade show, where a simple 3-digit number would change Sega's fate forever.
$299.
Oh, poor Saturn. That's got to be the worst first day on the job ever. Now, you may already be familiar with Sony's infamous mic drop moment at E3 1995, but the finer details are fascinating, so let's dive in. Sega took the stage first as Tom Kalinske announced to the world that their upcoming 32-bit Saturn wasn't coming out in September, it was available right now. 30,000 Saturns were shipped out to Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique and Software etc., ready for sale immediately at $399 a pop as part of a summer rollout. What a delightful surprise, right? The problem was, this wasn't just a surprise to the general public, but to pretty much everyone else. Major retailers like Best Buy and Walmart were understandably furious about being left out of the loop, and KB Toys even dropped Sega's products from store shelves entirely. Developers were angry about this release date, as many would miss a golden opportunity to be part of a console launch lineup, not to mention the damage this would do to a future player base and future sales for their own products. Even fans were annoyed, given they only shipped 30,000 units, making it near impossible to get a Saturn on launch day. This surprise shadow drop was misguided enough, but then Sony delivered the killing blow. On the same stage, on the same day, Steve Race, the head of Sony Computer Entertainment, is due on stage for a so-called brief speech. Race calmly walks up to the podium, shuffles his big stack of papers around, pauses, and says one thing: $299. And the crowd goes wild. With just 3 digits, Sony single-handedly destroyed what little credibility Saturn had left, undercutting its price by $100. What really adds some spice to this story is that Steve Race previously worked for Sega. In fact, he was Kalinske's right-hand man in marketing, a major part of the genius behind the Genesis success story. Kalinske stated himself years later that Steve knew all our secrets, but despite the supposed insider knowledge, Race had been debating with Sony about their own price right up until the morning, I'm quoting there, of E3 itself. The Saturn had been sunk by the same guy that helped kickstart Sega's golden age. As if that's not enough drama, Race resigned from Sony a couple of months after, before the PlayStation even launched in America due to disagreements with their head office in Japan. What a roller coaster. Back to E3, and the 32-bit battle broke out in full swing after the presentations. Sega turned up their booth speakers near Sony, drowning out their demos. Sony set up posters saying if you bought a Saturn, your head was in Uranus. Steve Race, the petty man, even popped Kalinske's inflatable Sonic. What a villain. Must have taken ages to pick up all those rings it dropped. The Saturn's fate seemed a cruel irony for Kalinske, a man who helped organize the first E3, but despite that, he never seemed too bothered, almost as if he knew how doomed they were from the start. The big $299 looked like a knockout blow, but the Saturn had already entered the ring dazed and confused. The Genesis did so well partly thanks to its early lead, releasing 2 years before the Super Nintendo. This wasn't a new tactic, however, as Sega's company ethos has always been, gotta go fast. Remember their coin-op arcade route we mentioned when you all fell asleep? No, you were paying attention. In that market, embracing new technology and providing the latest cool gimmicks was key to keeping customers coming and the coin flowing. But playing at the cutting edge means sometimes you end up injuring yourself. On the back of the Genesis, quite literally, came the Sega CD in 1991. This add-on represented an early step towards the disc-based future of gaming. Sadly, it flopped commercially, what with a retail price of $300 being more expensive than the host console console itself, and all for a low number and low quality of titles. It's a minor footnote in the Saturn story, but one Sega CD developer is noteworthy: Sony ImageSoft, who Sega helped on the software side. Foreshadow the Hedgehog has a bad feeling about this. By 1992, Western markets were still caught up in Genesis fever, but Japan's numbers were rather dismal, so Sega began planning their next big thing, codenamed Saturn, set to be the ultimate pixel powerhouse. But don't take my word for it. Go on, pop that hood and take a look. This bad boy was packing not one, but two CPUs, Hitachi's new SH2 chip, along with not one, but two video graphics processors, one for sprites and polygons, the other for 3D and backgrounds. The high-end Yamaha sound processor, just one this time, sorry, was capable of high-quality output, like this banger right here. And naturally, the CD-ROM drive itself meant games had loads more storage space for a fraction of the production cost of cartridges. Yes, that's a lot of hardware. No, it's not normal to have a billion processors, not for this era at least. Originally, Sega wanted it to be a 2D sprite machine on steroids, a Mega Drive on overdrive, if you will, because even though their Virtua Fighter took arcades by storm in '93 with its revolutionary 3D graphics, they still thought home consoles were years away from replicating this. The first iteration of Saturn's design was considered almost done in late 1993, but then the next-gen competition arrived with the Panasonic 3DO and the Atari Jaguar, and Sega started panicking about being left behind. An unthinkable proposition. Then, rumors started circling about the PlayStation's 3D polygonal power, sending Sega into full freak-out mode. 3D graphics were not only possible, but coming sooner than they thought. So in a real Tower of Power tribute, Sega started awkwardly bolting new bits to their existing Saturn hardware to beef it up. Sega's director and veteran engineering mastermind Hideki Sato added a second SH2 processor to help calculate 3D spaces, though this could have been the plan all along since the processor was designed to work effectively in pairs. The second video processor was also added to produce more polygons, although the Saturn used four-sided shapes, so technically they'd be called quadrilatergons? I don't know, I'm not a doctor. Naturally, this wacky hardware setup made development far more difficult. The potential for gorgeous 2D sprites and slick 3D models was high, but it needed a genius to even navigate it. Meanwhile, Sony's new machine included a BIOS and an API that made development far more user-friendly, which of course Saturn didn't have. They didn't even provide studios with development tools or documentation at first. These complex Saturn components weren't even cost-effective either. They were basically off-the-shelf parts from companies like Hitachi and Yamaha, compared to Sony, who were able to make custom parts all on their own. Saturn's hardware was a mess, and Sega were right to be worried about the competition. But could this competition have been avoided altogether? Looking at video game history in the 90s often feels like one big what-if moment. In an alternate universe, the fabled Nintendo PlayStation could have been a reality, uniting two great houses that surely would have dominated the industry. Instead, Nintendo burned Sony, which gave them renewed determination to break into the video game market. Now, that particular tale has been told many times, but less infamous is Sony's almost deal with Sega. We believe this happened at some point in 1992. Kalinske and his team at Sega of America were underwhelmed by early hardware specs for the Saturn, so they met with Sony to discuss the idea of a joint console. The logic was, since Sega always took a loss on hardware sales, they'd split the cost of hardware, but not software. Sega keeps all the profits from their own games, likewise for Sony. Kalinske had to convince the higher-ups in Japan, however, which included Sega president Hayao Nakayama, the notoriously strict, straight-talking boss. During this meeting, it became apparent that Nakayama was not a fan of Sony president Norio Olga, who revealed that Sega's old owners, Paramount, almost sold Sega to Sony in 1983, and Olga then went on to annoy Nakayama further by dodging the topic of partnership with several long, winding anecdotes. In the end, both parties agreed it wouldn't work out. Much like Nintendo, Sega feared the partnership would be uneven because of Sony's larger size, so Nakayama said, "Why would we help Sony in that way? We'll do our own system, and they can do whatever they want." The outspoken Kalinske called it the stupidest decision in the history of business, and I'm sure Foreshadow the Hedgehog might have had some choice words about it too. It says, "Be careful what you wish for." Huh. But wait, this what if gets better. On his personal quest to outdo Sega of Japan's pitched Saturn, Kalinsky met with Jim Clark, chairman of Silicon Graphics, who were experts in 3D graphics and movie VFX. Their new chipset was ideal for next-generation consoles, but after meeting them, Sega of Japan once again said no. Hideki Sato, the hardware maestro, said the chip was too big and would produce too much runoff waste in production.
This didn't mean the chip was literally too big for the console itself, by the way. This was about the manufacturing process, as multiple chips are made on a large wafer, as you can see, which so much mess, which creates varying degrees of excess material. So size and yield, I feel really bad about doing this, James. So size and yield rates are quite important here. Yum.
Kalinsky was understandably beyond exasperated. This wonder chip seemed more advanced in every way, and still, Japan said no. So when he broke the bad news to Silicon Graphics, he suggested another game company to Jim Clark, saying, "I think their name starts with an N." Yes, this tasty, forbidden chip ended up powering the Nintendo 64. Sega had the opportunity to work with Sony on a CD-based console and use the powerful chipset that the Nintendo 64 would end up using, but they blew it on both counts. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but even at the time, these decisions from Sega were mind-boggling. At least Sega also dodged a possible partnership with the ill-fated 3DO, so that's a silver lining, I suppose. The frustrated Kalinsky had one more trick up his sleeve, however.
Shall we get back to something Sega actually did make? What? The Saturn? No, we're talking about the 32X, you dafty.
Codenamed Project Mars, the ill-fated add-on for the Genesis was designed to be a cheaper entry point to the 32-bit era, aiming to capitalize on the large user base of the Genesis. It was also intended to fill the gap before the Saturn released in certain territories and to act as a speed bump against the competition. In reality, all it did was provide competition for itself, splitting the market and confusing fans and studios alike. Project Mars was originally conceived as a standalone unit, essentially an upgraded Genesis Pro, but the US team pushed for it to become an add-on instead, to avoid alienating their existing fan base. They believed the Genesis still had another year of life, at least, and Kalinsky was also keen to stop the undercooked Saturn from being rushed out. They borrowed elements from the Saturn's production, like the SH2 processors, and Sega of America headed up the 32X project, going head-to-head with Sega of Japan over hardware.
The result was, predictably, a disaster.
It only had 4 games at launch, totaling just 40 in its lifetime. It retailed for $160, far too much for the lack of games available. It looked like a mushroom-shaped tumor, requiring even more cords and adapters to work. But most damning was how the 32X launched in the US in November 1994, just one day before the Saturn released in Japan. Many fans were left wondering why they should drop a significant chunk of cash on a system that would be obsolete in less than a year and wouldn't even play the newer Saturn games anyway. Plus, Donkey Kong Country had just launched for the SNES, boasting some incredible graphical wizardry, all without needing an expensive add-on. So why couldn't Sega do this?
Finally, any brave souls who did drop money on Sega's so-called Band-Aid would be less likely to upgrade again in a few months. Sega split the bits and paid the price.
There's nothing wrong with a lower-cost entry to next-gen gaming, of course. Look at the early popularity of the Xbox Series S. But thanks to timing, price, practicality, and a lack of games, this 32-bit split not only harmed the 32X, but actively undermined the chances of the Saturn, which had enough problems to deal with anyway. Kalinsky would later admit the 32X was mostly just a marketing ploy. Nakayama's eventual replacement as president of Sega, Soichiro Irimajiri, called it a huge strategic blunder.
Any comment from the hedgehog this time? Thank you. Well, this is just expletives. I can't read that. You shouldn't have given me that.
And then, by March 1995, Kalinsky had received the order to surprise launch the Saturn at E3 that year, giving the 32X market just half a year before being totally cannibalized.
Why was Sega so determined to sabotage itself at every opportunity? Well, we have a couple of theories. Shh, keep your voice down. It's time to talk office politics.
We've already been introduced to the key figures on either side of this rift. In Japan, no-nonsense tough guy president Nakayama, and in America, Tom Kalinsky, the marketing maverick who conquered Nintendo.
But they weren't necessarily personal rivals. Nakayama was actually a big fan of Kalinsky.
He convinced Tom to join in 1990, and despite hating Kolinsky's hyper-aggressive plan to topple Nintendo, Nakayama kept faith in this strategy, which paid off big time, giving Kolinsky free rein to run Sega's US operations for a time. That is, until around 93 to 94, where Sega of America started swiftly losing their autonomy almost out of nowhere, leading to the bizarre decisions you've seen so far. It turns out Nakayama's admiration for Kolinsky during the Genesis era translated to disappointment in his own team as Sega continued to struggle in Japan. Apparently, he'd berate staff every Monday for their perceived failures, asking why revenue wasn't up like Tom has in the United States. He even got physical, sometimes slapping subordinates around. As Kolinsky put it, if you're a middle manager getting yelled at every week, you start to hate this Tom guy. Eventually, those same people rise the ranks in Sega of Japan, still holding that grudge, and start persuading Nakayama to tighten the leash.
Sega of America were literally a victim of their own success. At least this is the most popular narrative, a theory held by Kolinsky himself. But it's important to remember most of what we know comes from Sega of America. What about Japan's side to the story? Sources aren't so readily available, but there's a good chance this change simply boiled down to the most obvious aspect of business: money.
1993 felt like Sega at its peak, but if that were true, why would Nakayama state in a yearly review that they'd suffered hardship this past year? He cited 3 reasons for this: the worsening economic climate globally, the appreciation of the yen, which sounds like great news for a Japanese company except when their biggest sales are earned overseas, and finally, an off-season for arcade and home markets, aka a mid-generation slump. While overall revenue looked okay by 1994, export revenue had dipped massively, and to make matters worse, Sega of America was hemorrhaging money by this stage. It cost a lot to overtake a market leader like Nintendo, and their advertising budget alone went up from $10 million in 1989 to $95 million for 1993. Factor in the failed Sega CD, the design costs of the Saturn and 32X, other wacky experiments like Sega Pods and the Activator, Mega Drive's failure in Japan, consoles being discounted at a heavy loss. It was a lot. Profits were falling even in 1993, so these so-called glory years looked much more grim from high up in Sega HQ.
Whatever the reason for Japan's increasing interference, be it old grudges or simple budget constraints, rushing out their next console wasn't the solution, and that impacted the most important part of the console itself: the games.
It speaks volumes about how badly the Saturn was handled before it even released that we're only now covering the actual games. It'd be easy to trot out the classic "it didn't have enough games" line and swiftly move on, but that isn't entirely true.
Across its lifetime, the Saturn hosted 1,046 games, give or take, still miles behind the PlayStation's ludicrous total of 8,000, but compared to the Nintendo 64's minuscule 388 games, Saturn's library was respectable.
The only problem was 75% of that library were Japan exclusives, around 785 of them. That leaves only 261 Western releases, even less than the N64's Western library of 303. This skewed distribution could have evolved from Sega's early encouraging lead over Sony in Japan. In 1996, Kolinsky even claimed, "We are killing Sony" in that market, which sounds ridiculous now, but wasn't completely delusional at the time.
However, between the development difficulties from awkward hardware, the audience split between the 32X and Saturn, and the surprise early launch, developers were playing catch-up since day one, particularly noticeable in the sparse launch lineups.
Japan had 5 titles and only 2 first-party exclusives: the excellent, albeit downgraded, arcade port of Virtua Fighter and mediocre FMV detective game Wan Chai Connection. Virtua Fighter single-handedly carried the Japanese launch, but Sega wouldn't be so lucky elsewhere. The US got 6 titles, with Daytona USA and Panzer Dragoon being the other standouts, and the European launch 2 months later somehow got less than this, having to wait for Panzer Dragoon and Pebble Beach golf links. We could forgive one delay, but how dare you keep us from our Pebble Beach golf links, Sega?
You have entered Power Drive.
Had the US stuck to their original September release date, they could have added another 8 names to that lineup, including 2.5D platformer Bug, hack and slasher Shinobi Legions, and the iconic Myst. It's not like the Saturn was devoid of high-quality titles during its lifespan either. Sega's arcade credentials produced classics like Sega Rally Championship, Virtua Cop, House of the Dead, and Die Hard Arcade. The Saturn also became an RPG powerhouse with Shining Force 3, Grandia, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Magic Knight, Ray Earth, and countless others amongst a whopping including 135 role-playing games. But again, many of these were Japan-only releases, over 100 according to some sources.
And this hints at another issue, which wasn't about quantity or quality, it was the type of games being offered. The Saturn's strengths were pick-up-and-play arcade ports, role-playing games, classic shoot-em-ups, and 2D sprite-based platformers. But the market was changing, and new genres were emerging as games explored proper 3D.
Even with Saturn's best titles, most of them felt too familiar, mere improvements of existing formats. By comparison, Sony seemed to offer fresh new experiences on every disc. A long list of PS1 classics left their mark on the industry. Crash Bandicoot, Wipeout, Twisted Metal, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Tekken, Ridge Racer, Parappa the Rapper, Final Fantasy VII, all influential in various ways, and all those titles released in the first 2 years of the PlayStation, while the Saturn was still very much alive. And yes, we know some of those did come to the Saturn too. Tomb Raider actually debuted on the Saturn a month before PlayStation. But really, do any of us associate the original Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, or Wipeout with the Saturn? Didn't think so. The absence of hit sequels only hit the Saturn further. Third parties flocked to the PlayStation, leaving Saturn lacking in key areas that Sega once excelled in, such as their licensed sports titles. EA was a notable loss, leaving to back the Panasonic 3DO before backing the winning horse in Sony. Leaked marketing documents from 1996 perhaps say it best. Sports drove Sega Genesis' success. Sports is now a liability on Saturn, and most of Saturn's sports lineup was either poor quality, delayed past peak release time, or just non-existent. Sony also negotiated hard to entice heavy hitters like Square, Konami, and Williams Entertainment, later known as Midway. One of the biggest moves was securing a deal with Namco for Tekken and Ridge Racer, both effective answers to Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter, hitting Sega where it really hurt, right in their arcade credentials. Sega was outdone in every metric, but one notable absence might just have changed their fortunes. With overwhelming odds stacked against the poor Saturn, only one star had enough pulling power to stand a chance at saving the doomed console, and with all due respect, it wasn't Knights or Akira Yuki. Yes, we had to Google those names, which proves our point.
The Saturn needed Sonic, a name so synonymous with Sega that his absence in this video so far is weird enough. To miss a Sega console would be unthinkable. Fans were certain it was coming at some point, and many hoped it'd be a revolutionary step into 3 dimensions, unleashing the true power of the Saturn. Something extraordinary, something explosive, something extreme.
Unfortunately, the tale of Sonic Extreme became a metaphor for everything wrong with the Saturn itself. It was a hodgepodge of different ideas pulled in different directions, hampered by internal squabbles, needlessly complex development, and a rushed timeline. In late 1994, the project was given to Sega Technical Institute, the American team behind Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and funnily enough, a team founded by Mark Cerny, Sony's future hardware guru and another ex-Sega employee that would contribute to their downfall. Early concepts bounced from isometric views to 2.5D to fully 3D formats, and went from a 32X game to numerous ever-changing versions of Saturn hardware. When Sonic creator Yuji Naka saw their progress, he simply shook his head and said, "Good luck." But then, he made Balan Wonderworld and then got caught for insider trading, so what does he know? Development was split into 2 groups, working independently on 2 separate engines. One focused on the main levels, adopting a hybrid 2.5D platformer approach with a funky fisheye lens effect, all developed on PC to be ported to Saturn later. The other group made the boss stages, set in open 3D arenas, coded natively on the Saturn itself.
By March 1996, Nakayama inspected both parts, but the main level demo was an old version, poorly ported from PC, generally not representative of their current progress. The boss stage demo looked more impressive, so Nakayama ordered the whole game to be made like that, despite those sections only being a smaller part of the experience. So, the majority of the game needed remaking from scratch, and they only had a few months to do it to meet an October 1996 deadline. Hooray!
Meanwhile, Yuji Naka's Sonic team were finalizing Nights into Dreams, and after seeing an early build, Sonic Extreme programmer Christina Coffin asked Sega for the dev tools and code for Nights, knowing it would help their efforts massively. Amazingly, she got them! and everyone lived happily ever after for about 2 weeks. Turns out, Naka was very protective of his work, and he wasn't consulted about Sega sharing his precious code, so he redacted it all from Sonic X-treme, setting the team back even further.
Oh, I see. So that sort of insider trading is off limits, is it, Naka? You nearly gave me a paper cut, you criminal.
The boss stage team went full crunch mode, working sickening 20-hour days, and despite orders, the other teams were determined to finish their vision crunching equally hard. Of course, this crunch took its toll on both teams. Chris Sen, animator turned lead designer for Team Main Level, fell ill and was told he had just 6 months to live, and Coffin on the Boss Engine team caught severe pneumonia that almost killed her. The game was cancelled not long after, and so Sonic X-treme was confined to the big what-if bin along with Sega's future console ambitions and most of their mid-90s endeavours. Sonic did grace the Saturn a few times, but Sonic 3D Blast was a Genesis port that was anything but Blast in 3D. Sonic R was a mediocre racer, and Sonic Jam was just a compilation of old Mega Drive titles. The latter did include a bonus 3D stage, however, presumably an FU from Naka's team showing what they could have done if they really wanted. A whole segment of this video dedicated to a game that never released might seem like overkill, but Sonic really could have changed everything. One undeniably good game at the dawn of the 32-bit era could have undone the curse of 3D Sonic before it began, and maybe even save a dying console.
Unfortunately, fate had other plans for Sega, and not even the swift, spiky one could stop the Saturn from speeding off into the sunset far before its time.
Sega's journey to Saturn sure was a rough ride. The console's failure had a devastating impact on Sega as a whole, marking the beginning of the end for the plucky challengers. Alarm bells rang when Kalinske resigned in July 1996, replaced by Bernie Stolar, who would announce at E3 1997 that the Saturn is not our future, only 2 years after that fateful surprise launch. With only 12% of console market share at this point and Sega's continuing financial woes, nobody was surprised.
In March 1998, the Saturn was officially discontinued in the US, lasting less than 3 years, with only 7 games released in 1998. It lasted longer in Japan, even marginally outselling the Nintendo 64. I'd like to have that one explained to me, please. But with total worldwide sales of just 9.26 million units, the Saturn was deemed a commercial flop.
Sega's follow-up, the Dreamcast, wouldn't arrive in North America until September 1999, leaving over a year without new Sega titles, and despite being a technically impressive machine with some real cult classics, the Dreamcast couldn't undo the damage done by the Saturn. Let's recap this planetary palaver, shall we? While the golden age of the Genesis looked rosy from the outside, the financial costs were heavy, and this created an internal rift between East and West that led Sega into some very bizarre decisions. Panicked by growing competition from Sony and others, the Saturn's hardware design became increasingly complicated and difficult to develop for, while Sega of America's push for the 32X only split their core audience, confusing them further. At this point, a rushed surprise launch left the Saturn dead on arrival thanks to Sony's bombshell $299 knockout blow, and PlayStation pushed that advantage through more mature marketing, better business strategy, and simpler hardware that third parties flocked towards. The Saturn's smaller, less varied library, along with a very noticeable absence from Sonic, was the final nail in the coffin, as Sega struggled to pull themselves out of free fall.
It's unusual for company politics to be just as responsible for a console's failure as the hardware itself, but that's what makes Sega's story so fascinating. Their gung-ho, rockstar attitude captivated the gaming world and stunned the competition, but this same attitude became their downfall through overconfidence and creative differences, so to speak. Sega was still treating the console wars like a race, but in reality it was more like a game of poker. They showed their hand too early, panicked as more cards were revealed, and in the end, Sony called their bluff and won. It's a sad ending, because we'll probably never see another console challenger quite like them. Sega shot for the stars, but in the end, their ambitions for Saturn only brought them crashing back down to Earth.